Tuesday morning, Cedar Hollow Estates, and my mailbox holds a subpoena. The HOA is suing me, over 200 chickens. Neighbors gasp. At the meeting, I just smile, set my coffee down, and nod, because I found something buried in an old county file. Across town, Regina Vance stops answering her own phone. By Friday, one of us will lose everything we built. My name is Dana Whitfield, and this valley has raised 3 generations of my family. My grandfather cleared this land in 1962, long before anyone paved a road or drew a property line called Cedar Hollow Estates. I never imagined a chicken coop could start a war. I live here with my husband Mike, our daughter Lily, and 200 hens that give us eggs, a little income, and, honestly, a lot of peace. Weekends mean grading gravel, mending fences, and watching Lily chase feathers across the yard while the sun drops behind the hills. Cedar Hollow Estates grew up around my family's 4 acres years after we did, ringed by vineyards, tasting rooms, and manicured lawns. Most neighbors love the eggs I sell at the farmer's market. One neighbor, HOA President Regina Vance, has never once bought a dozen. Regina bought the old Kessler Vineyard 8 years ago and rebuilt it into Vance Family Winery, the crown jewel of every real estate brochure for Cedar Hollow. She ran for HOA president unopposed, promising to protect the character of our community, a phrase she repeated like scripture. Under Regina's rule, the HOA tightened rules nobody had enforced in decades. Mailbox colors, lawn heights, even what shrubs could line a driveway. Fines arrived by certified mail. Neighbors joked that Regina inspected yards through binoculars from her tasting room deck. And honestly, I believed it. My chickens predate the HOA itself, protected under an agricultural exemption clause from the original county deed. I mentioned this once at a board meeting. Regina smiled tightly and said the exemption was under review, a phrase that, looking back, should have worried me far more. Tourists loved wandering past my coop on their way to wine tastings, snapping photos of hens pecking near old oak fences. Vance Winery's own website used a photo of my rooster, Duke, without asking. When I brought it up, Regina called it community branding and changed the subject. Small tensions simmered under the surface. Regina's landscaping crew sprayed something along our shared property line every spring. And every spring my hens got sluggish for a few days. I chalked it up to weather, never dreaming to ask what exactly drifted over that fence. At HOA socials, Regina worked the room like a queen greeting subjects, air-kissing tourists who bought wine club memberships and barely nodding at families like mine. Her husband Ray, quiet and rarely seen, ran the actual vineyard operations while Regina handled vision and community relations. I noticed Regina's newest board recruits were young couples who'd bought vacation homes and barely lived here, easy votes for whatever she proposed. Longtime residents like the Hendersons and the Ortegas grumbled privately but never spoke up publicly, afraid of fines or worse, of being frozen out socially. One spring, a wine tourism magazine featured Cedar Hollow as the next Napa, with Regina front and center in the photos. She mentioned wanting to expand the winery's footprint, adding a new tasting pavilion and event lawn. Conveniently, drawings that stretched suspiciously close to my fence line. I started noticing surveyors on my property line without notice. Orange flags planted along the boundary between my hen's run and Regina's vines. When I called the county, they said a concerned resident had requested a boundary review. No name was listed, but I had a guess. My father, before he passed, always warned me that people who love control eventually stop asking and start taking. I laughed it off as an old man's grumbling. Standing at that fence line watching strangers measure my grandfather's land, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Regina began mentioning noise concerns casually at board meetings, always framed as neighbors' complaints, never her own opinion. She'd say things like, "Some folks feel the crowing starts too early," while looking directly at me, smiling the whole time like she was doing me a favor. I offered, in good faith, to build a taller sound buffering fence and move the rooster coop farther from the property line. Regina thanked me sweetly in front of everyone, then quietly tabled my proposal for further review 3 separate meetings in a row, never explaining why. Meanwhile, Vance Winery hosted weekend concerts with amplified bands until 11 at night, cars lining both sides of our narrow road. When I mentioned the noise, Regina explained that cultural events fell under a different bylaw category entirely, one that happened to exempt her own business. Lily started asking why Mrs. Vance didn't like our chickens. I didn't have a good answer for a 7-year-old. I told her some people just don't understand why feathers and dirt can be just as beautiful as grapevines and wine barrels. She seemed satisfied. I wasn't. Rumors swirled that Regina wanted my land specifically, not just quiet. A land broker named Colton Briggs had been seen touring the winery twice that spring, clipboard in hand, walking the fence line with Ray Vance and pointing toward my coop like it was already gone. I asked Ray directly about the broker one afternoon at the feed store. He went pale, mumbled something about expansion plans, and left without buying his usual bag of grain. Small towns don't keep secrets well, and Ray clearly hadn't been briefed on staying quiet. The HOA newsletter that month featured a full page on preserving our community's elegant standards, illustrated with a photo of the winery's new pavilion renderings. Tucked in a corner, a small note mentioned ongoing review of agricultural exemptions, with my address listed as an example. I finally requested my own copy of the original 1962 deed from the county archive, just to be sure of what I actually owned. The clerk warned me it might take weeks to locate the microfilm. I had no idea how much that single document would soon matter. That same week, 3 separate neighbors mentioned receiving anonymous flyers describing my hens as a biohazard risk to the neighborhood, complete with exaggerated claims about disease and property values. No name was printed, but the paper stock matched winery tasting room menus exactly. I brought the flyer to a board meeting, asking who authorized it. Regina examined it like she'd never seen it, frowning with practiced concern, and promised a full investigation. She adjourned the meeting 11 minutes early, the fastest I'd ever seen her end anything. The following Monday, a certified letter arrived, an official noise complaint against my property, citing excessive rooster crowing between 5 and 7 a.m. 3 signatures were attached. None of them neighbors I recognized as living within actual earshot of my coop. I drove straight to the addresses listed on the complaint. 2 were vacant lots Regina's LLC had purchased for future development. The 3rd belonged to a woman who told me, confused, that she'd simply signed something Regina's assistant handed her at a wine club event. Furious, I called an emergency meeting request, but the HOA secretary informed me such requests required board approval, which Regina alone could grant. Unsurprisingly, my request sat pending review for 2 full weeks, while the noise complaint clock quietly kept ticking against me. At the next scheduled meeting, Regina opened by reading the complaint aloud, voice full of manufactured sympathy, framing herself as merely protecting quality of life for all residents. I stood and calmly explained the addresses didn't match anyone actually living near my property. Regina countered smoothly that the exact identity of complainants was confidential per HOA privacy policy. I later learned, she'd personally added to the bylaws only 4 months earlier. The room murmured, uncertain, watching 2 versions of the story collide in real time. Mike squeezed my hand under the table, whispering that I should stay calm, that anger would only make me look guilty. I nodded, took a breath, and instead asked one simple question. Could the board produce recordings or a decibel log proving the crowing exceeded any limit? No such log existed. Regina admitted this, then pivoted instantly, suggesting a voluntary compliance period, during which I'd reduce my flock size by half while the board finalized standards. Voluntary, she called it, though refusal apparently meant automatic daily fines starting the following week. I refused outright, citing my grandfather's agricultural exemption, still waiting on confirmation from the county archive. Regina's smile flickered, just for a second, something sharper underneath the practiced warmth. We'll see what the records actually say, she said, and I felt a chill despite the summer heat. Within days, county inspectors arrived unannounced, responding to what they called an urgent complaint about livestock density and sanitation. They found nothing wrong. No violations. Healthy hens. Clean coops. Still, Regina mentioned the inspection in the newsletter as though it proved ongoing serious concerns. A neighbor, Priscilla Ames, the HOA treasurer, pulled me aside afterward, glancing nervously toward the winery. Watch yourself, she whispered. Regina doesn't lose. Ever. I thanked her, but something in her tone suggested she knew far more than she was willing to say out loud yet. That night, I finally opened the county archive email I'd been waiting on. The scanned 1962 deed confirmed an agricultural exemption tied permanently to my parcel, predating any HOA covenant by nearly 3 decades. I printed 3 copies immediately, hands shaking with relief and vindication. The next morning, I brought the deed straight to the HOA office, requesting it be entered into official meeting minutes. The administrative assistant, a young woman named Farah, took one look, went quiet, and said she'd need to check with Mrs. Vance before filing anything. 2 hours later, Farah called, apologetic, saying the document couldn't be located in the system, and the meeting minutes had already closed for the month. I asked her to check again. She hesitated, then admitted Regina had personally taken the folder from her desk that morning. I filed a formal records request with the county instead, bypassing the HOA entirely, demanding an official certified copy with a case number attached. One Regina couldn't simply lose. The clerk warned certified processing took 10 business days. 10 days felt like an eternity under looming fines. Meanwhile, the fake complainant I tracked down, the confused woman named Diane, called me privately, unsettled. She admitted Regina's assistant had described the paper as just a community survey, never mentioning it would become a legal complaint against a specific neighbor at all. Diane offered to write a signed statement clarifying she'd been misled about the document's true purpose. I thanked her, sensing my first real crack in Regina's carefully built case. Small as it was, it proved the noise complaint rested on something far shakier than she'd claimed. Regina apparently heard about Diane's statement within a day. Small towns being what they are. She showed up at Diane's house personally, staying nearly an hour. Afterward, Diane stopped answering my calls entirely, and her name mysteriously vanished from every future conversation about the complaint. Undeterred, I began keeping my own careful log, dates, times, weather, every interaction with the HOA, every visitor to my property, every strange car parked near the fence line. Mike thought I was being paranoid. I told him paranoid people don't usually turn out to be right. A week later, the HOA posted formal notice of a special hearing to determine agricultural exemption validity and noise compliance standards, scheduled in just 12 days. Convenient timing, since my certified county deed wouldn't arrive for another 3 days past that very hearing date. I called the county clerk, explained the situation, and begged for expedited processing given the looming hearing. She sighed sympathetically and said she'd try, but made no promises. For the first time since this began, I genuinely worried I might actually lose the fight ahead. I hired a local attorney, Marisol Cantu, who specialized in property and agricultural law. She reviewed my documents, nodding slowly, saying the exemption looked airtight on paper but warning that HOA hearings often ran on procedure and politics more than actual law, especially with a determined president. Marisol suggested requesting all HOA bylaw amendments from the past 8 years, curious whether the confidentiality policy Regina cited even existed properly. The request went in quietly through official channels. Time to avoid tipping off Regina before we actually had answers in hand. Meanwhile, Vance Winery announced a lavish harvest festival, complete with amplified music, food trucks, and hundreds of visitors expected along our shared road. I wondered aloud at a neighborhood gathering whether that event would also face noise-concerned scrutiny. Nobody answered. Exactly why. Fines started arriving anyway. $25 per day for unresolved noise violation, despite the pending hearing and unresolved exemption question. Marisol advised paying under written protest to avoid liens, while formally contesting every charge. I hated writing those checks, but she insisted patience would matter more than pride. Priscilla Ames approached me again, this time at the grocery store, further from prying eyes. She mentioned that board votes on my case had never actually been official votes. Just Regina announcing decisions and nobody objecting. We're all scared of her, Priscilla admitted. Eyes down. I asked Priscilla directly why she was scared. She hesitated, mentioned a code violation on her own deck that Regina had quietly overlooked for 2 years. As a favor, implying the favor could vanish the instant Priscilla stopped voting the way Regina wanted at meetings. That admission planted a seed I couldn't shake. How many board members were compromised the same way? Held in place not by loyalty but by quiet leverage? I began wondering whether Regina's entire unopposed reign rested less on popularity and more on carefully collected obligations. Tom Callahan, the HOA secretary, called me privately one evening, voice hushed. He'd found something odd reviewing old meeting archives. The agricultural exemption bylaw Regina cited as under review had actually been quietly amended 2 years earlier, removing protective language without a documented majority vote. Tom offered to pull the original signed amendment from storage, though he warned it might take him a few days to access the locked filing cabinet without drawing attention. I thanked him, cautious but hopeful, aware that Tom risked his own standing on the board by helping me. Days later, my well water tested slightly off during a routine annual check. Elevated chemical traces I couldn't immediately identify. My hens had also seemed sluggish again for nearly a week straight. Feathers dull. Egg production dipping noticeably. I filed the water report away, unsettled but not yet certain why. Marisol's records request finally returned partial results. The amendment Tom mentioned did exist. Dated, signed only by Regina and one absent board member listed as present. 2 other signature lines sat conspicuously blank. Missing the required quorum the HOA's own charter demanded for legitimate changes. We now had 2 threads pulling at Regina's case. A possibly forged bylaw amendment and unexplained chemical traces near my well. Neither was proof of anything criminal yet, but together they suggested a pattern of cutting corners whenever the truth threatened Regina's carefully polished image. Regina, apparently sensing resistance building, escalated instead of backing down. A new letter arrived, citing unauthorized structural changes to my coop, threatening removal within 30 days if I didn't submit fresh architectural plans for HOA approval. Despite my coop predating the HOA by decades, I began attending every board meeting, recording audio openly with permission, determined to build an undeniable record. Regina grew visibly irritated by my presence, often cutting agenda items short whenever my case approached, rescheduling discussions due to time constraints that never seemed to affect other topics. One evening, Hector Ramos, a longtime vineyard worker at Vance Winery, stopped me near the feed store, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "You should look at what we spray near your fence line," he murmured, before walking off quickly, refusing to say anything further that night. I mentioned Hector's comment to Marisol, who immediately suggested formally requesting Vance Winery's pesticide application records from the County Agricultural Office, a public document any resident could theoretically access, though wineries rarely faced scrutiny given their protected economic status within the community. The request process moved slowly. County offices notoriously understaffed. Records scattered across departments. Meanwhile, Regina scheduled the exemption hearing earlier than originally announced, citing urgent community welfare concerns, conveniently landing just 2 days before my certified deed copy was expected to finally arrive. Marisol filed an emergency motion requesting a 2-week hearing postponement, citing pending document verification directly relevant to the case. The HOA board, controlled by Regina's loyal majority, denied the motion unanimously, except for one quiet abstention from Tom Callahan, who avoided meeting my eyes afterward. Community sentiment began shifting slightly, though. Longtime neighbors who'd previously stayed silent started approaching me quietly, sharing stories of their own frustrations with Regina's selective enforcement, unequal fines, and mysteriously vanishing paperwork whenever inconvenient truths threatened her polished community image. The Hendersons revealed they'd once faced a fabricated complaint too, over a garden shed, only for it to disappear entirely after they agreed to join Regina's beautification committee, essentially becoming loyal votes. Pattern after pattern emerged, each one echoing exactly what I now faced myself. I started a simple shared document, gathering these stories anonymously, dates and details carefully recorded, building what Marisol called a pattern of conduct file, Potentially useful if this dispute ever escalated beyond HOA meetings into actual county or civil court proceedings down the road. Regina, apparently catching wind of neighbors talking, hosted an impromptu community appreciation evening at the Winery. Free wine, live music, warm smiles for everyone, conspicuously not inviting my family. Several neighbors later told me attending felt uncomfortable, like being quietly reminded who controlled the community's goodwill. Lily came home from school upset one afternoon. A classmate whose parents sat on Regina's beautification committee had told her, "Chickens don't belong in nice neighborhoods." I hugged my daughter tightly, promising her our hens belonged here just as much as anyone's manicured lawn or wine barrel. That night, Mike and I talked seriously about whether fighting was even worth the exhaustion and stress accumulating daily. I admitted I was tired too, but something about watching Lily's confused hurt hardened my resolve completely. This wasn't just about chickens anymore. It was about fairness itself. The certified deed copy finally arrived. 2 days ahead of schedule. An unexpected stroke of luck after the clerk's promised effort to expedite processing. Marisol reviewed it carefully, confirming the agricultural exemption's legal strength. Airtight, unambiguous, predating the HOA's very existence by nearly 30 years. We now had solid legal footing heading into the hearing. But Marisol-worn documents alone rarely defeated someone as politically entrenched as Regina. HOA hearings are theater, she said. We need the room on our side too. Not just the paperwork. However strong it might be, I decided to invite neighbors directly to the hearing, explaining honestly what was happening, hoping shared experience might finally overcome shared fear. Several agreed quietly to attend, though few promised to speak publicly, still wary of Regina's reach into fines, favors, and quiet social consequences. 2 nights before the hearing, someone left a dead rooster near my mailbox. No note, no explanation. Mike wanted to call the sheriff immediately. I agreed, shaken but strangely more determined than frightened, certain now that whoever felt threatened enough to do this knew exactly how close we'd gotten. The sheriff's deputy who responded took photographs, collected the bird for potential evidence, and mentioned quietly that county animal control had received a separate anonymous tip that same week about illegal chemical dumping near a local vineyard's water source, though no formal report had been filed yet. That single mention lodged itself in my mind immediately. Illegal chemical dumping near a vineyard, near a water source. I thought instantly of Hector's whispered warning at the feed store, and of my own well testing strangely months earlier. 2 threads, quietly, were beginning to weave together. The sheriff's investigation into the dead rooster prompted an automatic 30-day postponement of all pending HOA hearings involving my property, a procedural pause neither Regina nor I could challenge. For the first time in weeks, an uneasy quiet settled over our little corner of Cedar Hollow. Mike and I used the break to simply breathe, taking Lily fishing at the creek behind our property, something we hadn't managed in months. Watching her laugh chasing minnows reminded me why this fight mattered, and also why I needed to protect her from its constant weight. Marisol used the pause productively, quietly following up on the county's pesticide records request, and gently encouraging Hector, through a mutual acquaintance, to consider what he actually knew and whether he'd ever feel comfortable sharing it formally, without pressuring him beyond what felt safe. Tom Callahan reached out again, mentioning he'd finally accessed the locked filing cabinet and found the original amendment paperwork. confirming what we suspected. Only 2 signatures, missing quorum entirely. He photographed it discreetly on his phone, promising to share copies once he felt it was safe to. Priscilla, emboldened slightly by the quiet, admitted during a private coffee that Regina had mentioned my family specifically during a closed-door strategy session, saying something like, "The Whitfield problem needs to disappear before the resort deal closes." Neither of us knew yet what resort deal meant. That phrase, resort deal, nagged at me for days. I asked around discreetly, learning that a regional hospitality company had been scouting hill country vineyards for luxury expansion projects, rumored to be in talks with several wineries, though nothing had been publicly confirmed by anyone involved yet. Marisol suggested checking county planning department records for any pending zoning or development applications tied to Vance Winery or adjacent parcels, including mine. Sure enough, a preliminary inquiry existed, filed months earlier, mapping potential expansion that conspicuously included my 4 acres as future acquisition target. Seeing my own family's land labeled that way in an official document hit differently than any noise complaint ever had. This wasn't really about roosters or crowing hours at all. It was about clearing an inconvenient obstacle from a much larger, much more profitable business plan entirely. I shared this discovery with Marisol, Tom, and quietly with a few trusted neighbors, careful not to let word travel back to Regina prematurely. Everyone agreed the picture was becoming clearer, uglier, and far more calculated than a simple dispute over chickens and quiet mornings ever suggested. Hector finally reached out directly, nervous but resolved, asking to meet somewhere private, away from the winery and away from town gossip. He said he had photographs on his phone, taken months earlier, that he'd never shown anyone, afraid of losing his job or worse. We arranged to meet at Marisol's office, a neutral, professional space where Hector could speak freely with legal protection guiding the conversation. Driving there that evening, I felt something shift inside me, a mixture of dread and relief, sensing we were finally approaching real answers. Hector arrived quietly, clutching his phone like it held something dangerous, which, in a way, it did. He sat down, took a breath, and said simply, "I need you to understand. I didn't want to be part of this," before beginning to explain everything he'd witnessed. Hector explained that for the past year, Vance Winery had used a concentrated pesticide called chlorpyrifos extra, banned for use within 200 feet of shared water sources under state agricultural code, sprayed directly along the vine rows closest to my property line, closest to our shared aquifer. His phone held dated photographs, unmarked drums stored behind the equipment barn, application logs scrawled hastily rather than typed properly, and one video showing Ray Vance personally directing the spray crew closer to the fence line than any safety buffer should have ever allowed. Hector explained he'd raised concerns internally once, quietly, only to be told by Ray that Regina handles compliance stuff, and that questioning procedure risked his job. He'd stayed silent since, terrified, until watching the dead rooster incident convinced him someone might genuinely get hurt if he did nothing. Marisol carefully documented everything Hector shared, treating it as a whistleblower disclosure, protecting his identity as much as legally possible. While preparing a formal environmental complaint to file with the county's agricultural and water quality divisions the following morning, first thing, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and heartbreak hearing it all. My hen's sluggish spells, my well's odd chemical readings, None of it had been imagination or coincidence. Someone's negligence, or worse, deliberate corner-cutting, had quietly poisoned the ground I'd trusted my whole life. The formal complaint went in the next morning, citing specific dates, chemical names, and photographic evidence, triggering an automatic county environmental review, given the severity of the alleged violation near a shared residential water source affecting multiple properties, not just my own. Word apparently traveled fast once county officials contacted Vance Winery for comment. By that afternoon, Hector called Marisol in a panic, saying Ray had confronted him directly, accusing him of disloyalty, though stopping short of firing him outright, likely wary of appearing retaliatory given active scrutiny. Regina responded publicly within hours, posting a lengthy statement to the community forum insisting the complaint was malicious retaliation from a disgruntled neighbor facing HOA fines, cleverly reframing herself as the victim of my supposed vendetta rather than addressing any actual pesticide allegations. Her statement worked exactly as intended on some residents, several commenting supportive messages defending Regina's integrity and questioning my timing suspiciously close to my own hearing. I felt the familiar sting of being publicly painted as the villain in a story I hadn't started. Priscilla called me quietly that evening, voice shaking. She'd attended an emergency closed-door board session where Regina instructed everyone to stay unified and avoid discussing the water thing publicly, framing it purely as legal strategy rather than genuine concern for community safety or health. During that same closed session, Priscilla recorded audio secretly on her phone, something she admitted felt terrifying but necessary after months of quiet coercion. She heard Regina mention the resort deal explicitly, saying the chicken situation needed resolving before due diligence concluded within 60 days. Priscilla shared the recording with Marisol under careful legal guidance, ensuring everything remained admissible and properly handled rather than leaked recklessly. The recording confirmed what we'd suspected. My property mattered far more to Regina's business ambitions than any rooster ever crowed loud enough to explain. Tom finally felt safe enough to formally share his photographed copy of the forged bylaw amendment. Missing required signatures, dated conveniently just months after Regina's resort discussions apparently began, suggesting the exemption rollback wasn't really about community standards at all, but about clearing legal obstacles. Marisol began weaving these separate threads. Forged amendment, missing quorum, pesticide violations, secret resort negotiations, into a single, cohesive legal narrative. One suggesting a pattern of deliberate misconduct rather than a simple, sincere disagreement over noise and neighborly courtesy. Regina, apparently sensing the walls closing in slightly, escalated her public messaging further, hiring a small public relations consultant named Brooke to manage community perception, flooding the neighborhood forum with polished posts about unity, progress, and protecting Cedar Hollow's beautiful future together. Brooke's posts subtly painted me as an outsider resisting positive change, someone clinging to outdated agricultural nostalgia, while the community modernized around wine tourism and elegant new amenities. It stung reading strangers' comments agreeing, unaware of what actually sat beneath Regina's carefully crafted narrative. Meanwhile, the county's environmental investigator, a soft-spoken man named Dave Reyes, scheduled a formal site visit, requesting soil and water samples from both properties. Something about his last name felt oddly familiar, though I couldn't quite place why until he introduced himself in person. Dave mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he'd grown up nearby and remembered visiting my grandfather's farm as a boy with his own father, an old family friend from decades earlier. He assured me the connection wouldn't influence his findings, only that he'd handle the case with proper diligence. His visit was thorough, methodical, and entirely professional, collecting samples from multiple points along the fence line, the shared well, and even soil near my chicken run. He explained results would take several weeks through official state laboratories. No shortcuts, regardless of personal history or pressure. Regina, apparently informed of Dave's visit almost immediately, hosted her harvest festival that same weekend anyway, drawing hundreds of visitors despite the ongoing investigation, seemingly determined to project confidence and normalcy rather than allow any hint of scandal to touch her carefully polished public image. A small group of neighbors, myself included, quietly attended the festival too, not to protest loudly, but simply to be present, visible, unwilling to be erased from the community narrative Regina and Brooke were so carefully constructing around wine, elegance, and manufactured neighborhood harmony. Standing near the festival's edge, I watched Regina work the crowd flawlessly, laughing, posing for photos, utterly composed despite everything unfolding behind the scenes. For a brief moment, I almost admired her discipline, before remembering exactly what that discipline had cost so many people quietly. Ray Vance approached me near the parking area, looking exhausted, guilt written plainly across his face. He apologized quietly for the spray crew's proximity to my fence, admitting he'd raised concerns to Regina privately months earlier, only to be told the buffer zone was close enough. I asked Ray directly whether he'd known about the resort deal's connection to my property. He hesitated, then nodded slowly, admitting Regina had mentioned needing the Whitfield land eventually, though he insisted he'd never agreed with pursuing it through lawsuits, fines, or fabricated complaints. His honesty, however belated, gave me a strange, complicated sympathy for him, a man clearly caught between loyalty to his wife and growing discomfort with her methods. I thanked him for finally speaking honestly, though it changed nothing about the mounting evidence against the winery itself. That night, someone slashed 2 of my truck tires in the driveway. No note, no witnesses, cameras conveniently angled away from the actual driveway due to a maintenance issue I hadn't reported. The sheriff took the report seriously, though evidence remained frustratingly circumstantial once again. Marisol advised installing a proper security camera system immediately, both for safety and for building an evidentiary record should further incidents occur. Mike, increasingly worried for our family's safety, agreed without hesitation, and within 2 days, cameras covered every angle of our property line. The rescheduled HOA hearing date finally arrived on the calendar, now just 3 weeks away, alongside Dave Reyes's expected laboratory results and mounting pressure from neighbors. Demanding transparency after Priscilla's recording, carefully summarized without violating attorney guidance, began circulating quietly through trusted community channels. Regina responded by demanding an emergency board meeting to address unauthorized recordings and community disruption, clearly aiming to preemptively discredit
Priscilla before her recording's existence became public knowledge, framing the situation as a privacy violation rather than genuine misconduct exposure.
Priscilla, terrified but resolute, refused to resign from the board despite Regina's not-so-subtle pressure, stating simply that she'd rather face consequences. For recording a meeting then continue enabling decisions she genuinely believed harmed her neighbors and misrepresented the community's actual values. Tension within the board itself became increasingly visible. Tom and Priscilla now openly questioning procedural decisions Regina previously pushed through unopposed. Two other board members, sensing shifting winds, began asking pointed questions too, uncertain which side ultimately held the stronger position moving forward. Regina, apparently rattled by growing internal dissent, made a critical mistake. She publicly accused me, by name, at a community forum post, of orchestrating a coordinated smear campaign against her family's business, explicitly connecting my chickens, Hector, Priscilla, and Tom as supposed co-conspirators. Marisol seized on this immediately, noting Regina's public statement essentially confirmed awareness of multiple independent whistleblowers, undermining her earlier claim that everything stemmed solely from my personal vendetta. Sometimes, Marisol said, opponents reveal their weakest points precisely when they feel most cornered. Local news picked up the brewing story shortly after. A small regional outlet covering HOA drama in wine country, initially framing it lightly, almost comically, before reporters began digging deeper into the pesticide allegations and discovering the pending resort deal documentation through public records requests. Suddenly, Cedar Hollow Estates found itself the subject of actual journalism. Not just neighborhood gossip, reporters requesting interviews with Regina, myself, and county officials involved in the ongoing environmental investigation. Regina's carefully managed narrative began slipping further from her tightening, increasingly desperate control. Brooke, Regina's PR consultant, reportedly advised her to lay low temporarily, avoid further public statements, and let lawyers handle communication instead. For the first time since this began, Regina's confident public persona seemed to genuinely crack. Canceled appearances replacing her usual polished, ever-present visibility. I felt the shift too. In quieter ways, neighbors greeting me warmly again, some apologizing for earlier silence, admitting fear had kept them quiet longer than conscience should have allowed. Community sentiment, slowly but unmistakably, began turning away from Regina's carefully constructed reputation. Dave Reyes's preliminary laboratory results arrived earlier than expected, confirming elevated levels of the banned pesticide in both soil samples near the shared fence line and water samples from the shared well, directly correlating with documented dates matching Hector's photographed application logs perfectly. The county issued Vance Winery a formal notice of violation, mandating immediate cessation of the specific pesticide's use, remediation planning, and a substantial fine pending further review, with potential additional penalties if intentional concealment could be proven through ongoing investigation into application records. Regina's lawyer released a brief statement calling the findings preliminary and disputed, promising full cooperation while denying any intentional wrongdoing. Meanwhile, my own attorney quietly prepared to amend our HOA hearing defense, now armed with independent confirmation of environmental violations directly benefiting my case narrative. At home, Lily asked if the bad lady was going to stop hurting our chickens now. I told her the truth was finally coming out, slowly, the way truth often does, and that sometimes doing the right thing takes far longer than anyone would ever want it to. Regina, cornered but far from finished, apparently decided escalation remained her only path forward. She filed a defamation lawsuit against me personally, alleging I'd orchestrated a coordinated campaign to damage her business and reputation, seeking significant monetary damages alongside a restraining order request. Marisol wasn't surprised, calling it a classic intimidation tactic designed to drain my resources and energy rather than genuinely expecting to win in court. Still, she warned, defending against it would require real time, real money, and real emotional resilience I'd need to muster. The restraining order hearing, scheduled hastily, required me to prove I hadn't personally directed Hector, Priscilla, or Tom's disclosures, a frustrating but manageable task given how clearly each of them had acted independently, driven by their own conscience rather than any coordination from me. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating that the resort company considering Vance Winery's expansion had grown noticeably nervous about the unfolding scandal, quietly requesting additional documentation before proceeding further with due diligence. A development Regina apparently hadn't anticipated when she'd first pursued this entire scheme. I learned through Ray, still quietly cooperating, that the resort deal represented far more than expansion ambition. It was actually Regina's desperate attempt to save the winery from mounting debt after several disappointing harvests. Debt she'd hidden carefully behind the business's polished, prosperous public image. That revelation complicated my feelings considerably. Regina wasn't simply cruel for cruelty's sake. She was frightened, drowning financially, willing to sacrifice fairness and honesty to protect everything she'd built. Understanding her motive didn't excuse her methods, but it did make her feel painfully, undeniably human. Despite Ray's quiet sympathy, Regina pushed forward relentlessly, apparently convinced that surrender now meant losing absolutely everything she'd spent years building. Her lawyer requested the restraining order hearing be expedited, hoping to silence or restrict my involvement in the upcoming HOA exemption hearing entirely. The judge, however, reviewed the defamation and restraining order request skeptically, noting Regina's own public statements naming me directly, alongside insufficient evidence connecting me to Hector, Priscilla, or Tom's independent actions. The request was denied outright, a small but meaningful legal victory. Regina's frustration apparently boiled over privately. Priscilla told me, shaken, that Regina had screamed at board members during another closed session, accusing everyone of betraying the community's future and threatening legal action against anyone who spoke publicly about internal HOA matters going forward. 2 nights later, someone released 20 of my hens deliberately, cutting through the coop fencing under cover of darkness. Security cameras Mike installed weeks earlier captured a hooded figure, face obscured, moving with clear familiarity around our property, suggesting intimate knowledge of our land's layout. The sheriff reviewed the footage carefully, unable to confirm identity definitively, though the figure's build and movement patterns matched Regina's landscaping crew supervisor, a man named Dale who'd worked at Vance Winery for years and had access to property surveys from the earlier boundary review request. Recovering scattered hens across acres of darkened property took hours. Mike, Lily, and I searching by flashlight while neighbors, hearing commotion, arrived unprompted to help. Watching people I barely knew wade through brush at midnight to save my family's chickens moved me more than any speech could. We recovered all but 3 hens by dawn. Exhausted but grateful. The incident, however frightening, backfired badly for Regina's narrative. Several neighbors who'd helped that night now openly questioning how anyone could genuinely support someone capable of, or connected to, such deliberately cruel actions. Dave Reyes's continued investigation uncovered additional application logs, previously undisclosed, showing pesticide spraying had occurred even after the initial violation notice. A serious escalation suggesting either gross negligence or deliberate defiance of county orders during an active, ongoing environmental review process. This new violation triggered a much larger fine and, more significantly, a criminal referral for potential willful violation of environmental protection statutes, elevating the entire situation from a civil HOA dispute into genuine legal jeopardy for Vance Winery and potentially for Regina personally. Regina's attorney reportedly advised her strongly to cooperate fully and minimize further public statements. But Regina, apparently unable to accept losing control entirely, called an unscheduled community meeting herself, determined to address misinformation directly before she believed things spiraled further beyond her management. The meeting, held at the community clubhouse, drew an unusually large crowd, word having spread widely by now through local news coverage, neighborhood gossip, and growing curiosity about how far this HOA dispute had genuinely escalated beyond anyone's original expectations months earlier. Regina stood before the packed room, composed outwardly despite visible strain beneath her practiced smile, insisting the pesticide findings were exaggerated, the amendment properly executed, and the resort deal merely preliminary exploration, unrelated to any pressure against specific neighbors like my family. Tom Callahan, sitting quietly in the audience, finally stood up unprompted, holding his photographed copy of the forged amendment aloft, asking Regina directly, in front of everyone, to explain the 2 missing board signatures required by the HOA's own charter for legitimate bylaw changes. The room fell utterly silent. Regina's composure faltered visibly for the first time in public, stammering something about administrative oversight before Marisol, seated beside me, calmly stood and requested the meeting be formally adjourned pending proper legal review of all disputed governance documents. Brooke, watching from the back, quietly gathered her things and left without a word, apparently recognizing that no amount of polished messaging could salvage what was rapidly unraveling in real time before an entire community finally seeing through months of carefully constructed misdirection. Regina attempted one final gambit before the meeting fully dissolved into chaos, claiming Hector had fabricated his photographs out of resentment over a recent pay dispute, a desperate accusation that instantly backfired when Hector himself stood up from the audience. Calm and resolute, Hector explained plainly that he'd never had any pay dispute, that he'd stayed silent out of genuine fear for his job, and that he was speaking now only because watching a family's chickens deliberately released into darkness had crossed a line he couldn't ignore any longer. The crowd's reaction shifted palpably, sympathetic murmurs replacing earlier uncertainty. Several longtime residents openly voicing support for Hector, Priscilla, and Tom, thanking them for finally revealing what many had quietly suspected but felt powerless to confront alone against Regina's carefully consolidated authority. Regina, visibly cornered, made one final desperate move, announcing she'd be filing additional legal action against Hector, Tom, and Priscilla individually, for breach of confidentiality, a threat that landed with noticeably less force now, given the room's collectively shifting sympathy and growing skepticism. Marisol calmly reminded everyone present that whistleblower protections generally applied to environmental and governance misconduct disclosures,
and that further retaliatory legal threats might actually strengthen, rather than weaken, any eventual case against Regina and the winery's mounting legal troubles overall.
The meeting ended without formal resolution, but something fundamental had shifted irreversibly that night. Cedar Hollow Estates no longer saw Regina as its unquestioned, elegant leader. They saw, perhaps for the first time clearly, someone willing to sacrifice honesty and neighbors alike for personal ambition. Driving home afterward, Mike squeezed my hand, quiet for a long moment before saying simply, "I think we actually might win this." I wanted desperately to believe him, though exhaustion and lingering caution kept me from celebrating anything until the actual hearing finally arrived. 2 days later, Dave Reyes's office confirmed the criminal referral had been formally accepted for review by the County District Attorney's Office, elevating the pesticide violations into genuine potential prosecution territory, separate entirely from the civil HOA dispute still awaiting its rescheduled exemption hearing. Regina's legal troubles multiplied rapidly from there. The resort company formally withdrew its expansion interest, citing unresolved regulatory concerns,
effectively collapsing the very deal that had apparently motivated months of manufactured complaints, forged documents, and increasingly desperate, dangerous retaliatory actions against my family.
Priscilla told me Regina had grown noticeably erratic behind closed doors, canceling board meetings entirely, avoiding winery staff, reportedly drinking heavily, according to Ray, who'd confided in a mutual friend that he genuinely worried about his wife's spiraling mental state amid collapsing circumstances. Despite everything, part of me couldn't fully celebrate watching someone unravel, however deserved the consequences felt. I remembered Regina's earlier fear about losing everything, and understood, uncomfortably, that desperation had driven her methods, even if desperation never truly justified the harm ultimately caused. Marisol reminded me gently that sympathy and accountability weren't mutually exclusive. I could understand Regina's fear while still insisting on truth,
fairness, and consequences for genuinely harmful actions taken against my family, my chickens, and honestly, the entire community she'd once claimed to protect.
The rescheduled HOA hearing finally arrived, now transformed entirely from its original framing. What began as a simple noise complaint had become a referendum on Regina's leadership itself. Community trust, forged governance documents, environmental violations, and months of quiet manipulation finally reaching a breaking point. The clubhouse overflowed that evening, far exceeding any previous meeting's attendance. Neighbors standing along walls, spilling into the hallway, everyone sensing correctly that Cedar Hollow Estates stood at a genuine turning point regarding its future leadership and its fundamental community values going forward. Regina arrived late, noticeably subdued, without Brooke, without her usual entourage of loyal supporters, flanked only by her attorney, who advised her repeatedly, visibly, to remain quiet and let legal counsel handle procedural matters rather than engage directly with the increasingly hostile audience. The board, now visibly fractured, opened proceedings awkwardly, Tom serving as acting chair given Regina's diminished standing, formally presenting both the forged amendment, evidence and Priscilla's legally reviewed recording excerpt confirming Regina's explicit instructions to prioritize the resort deal over legitimate community concerns. I sat quietly beside Marisol, watching months of exhausting struggle finally converge into this single decisive evening, feeling strangely calm despite the enormous stakes, comforted somehow by Lily's small hand gripping mine tightly from the seat beside me throughout the entire proceeding. Marisol presented our case methodically, the certified 1962 deed confirming my agricultural exemption, the forged bylaw amendment lacking proper quorum, and independent county confirmation of environmental violations directly tied to Regina's winery, painting a clear, undeniable picture for the assembled board and community. Regina's attorney attempted a final procedural objection, arguing personal disputes shouldn't influence official HOA governance decisions. But the board, no longer solely under Regina's control, voted to accept all submitted evidence into official record, a small but symbolically enormous shift in institutional power. As the board prepared to deliberate formally, Regina requested a brief recess, stepping outside alone for several minutes. When she returned, something in her posture had changed entirely, less defiant, more resigned, as though she finally understood the outcome was no longer within her control. The board's deliberations stretched nearly 45 minutes. The room tense with hushed conversation and nervous energy. Neighbors whispering theories about outcomes while Lily quietly asked me if we were winning yet. A question I honestly couldn't answer with any real certainty at that moment. Tom finally returned to the podium, visibly nervous, announcing the board's preliminary findings. The agricultural exemption would be formally reinstated immediately, given the certified deed's undeniable legal standing, effectively ending the original noise complaint and coop modification demands against my family entirely. A ripple of applause spread through the room, quickly hushed as Tom continued, explaining the board still needed to address the forged amendment's legal validity, Regina's leadership standing, and formal community response to the ongoing county investigation into environmental violations at Vance Winery. Regina's attorney requested time to prepare a formal response regarding leadership standing, but several board members, emboldened now, pushed for an immediate vote on removing Regina from her presidency, citing clear evidence of governance fraud, deceptive conduct, and repeated retaliatory actions against residents. The room grew tense again, Regina sitting rigidly, staring at some fixed point across the room, her earlier polish entirely gone, replaced by something rawer, more exposed than I'd ever witnessed from her throughout months of careful, controlled public composure and calculated performance. Priscilla stood then, voice shaking but steady, describing the quiet coercion she'd endured for years, the small favors traded for loyal votes, the fear that had kept her silent until finally, watching a family's chickens released cruelly into darkness. She simply couldn't stay quiet anymore. Her testimony landed heavily across the room, several other neighbors nodding along, some visibly emotional, recognizing pieces of their own quiet compliance, reflected uncomfortably in Priscilla's honest, vulnerable account of years spent navigating Regina's carefully constructed system of favors, fear, and consequences. Hector spoke next, briefly but powerfully, explaining he'd stayed employed at the winery specifically because he loved the land itself, the vines, the seasonal rhythm of harvest work, never imagining loyalty to that land would eventually require exposing dangerous practices threatening his neighbor's safety. Ray Vance, unexpectedly, stood from the back of the room, asking permission to speak. Regina's head snapped toward him, surprised, as he walked forward slowly, visibly torn between protecting his wife and finally acknowledging the truth he'd known privately for months but hadn't voiced publicly. Ray admitted, voice breaking slightly, that he'd known about the pesticide's proximity to the shared well, known about the forged amendment's questionable signatures, and known about the resort deal's connection to pressuring my family off our land. choosing silence out of fear and misplaced loyalty. His admission, delivered with genuine remorse rather than defensiveness, seemed to shift something in the room's collective mood. Less anger now, more a heavy, sorrowful recognition that this entire situation had damaged far more than just one neighborly dispute over roosters and property lines. Regina finally stood herself, visibly shaking, and asked the board for permission to speak directly, her attorney's objection overruled by the room's collective, almost unanimous insistence that she finally address everything openly, honestly, without further deflection, or carefully rehearsed public relations messaging. She began haltingly, admitting the winery's finances had collapsed further than she'd ever publicly acknowledged, admitting fear of losing everything her family had built had driven decisions she now recognized as genuinely wrong, harmful, and inexcusable regardless of the financial desperation underlying them. Regina described growing up on her own family's struggling vineyard decades earlier, watching her parents lose everything to a single bad harvest season. A formative fear she'd carried into adulthood, one that had ultimately twisted into controlling, manipulative behavior she now recognized clearly, painfully, publicly. Her words offered context, not excuse, and I felt that distinction clearly even as something within me softened slightly, hearing genuine vulnerability finally replace months of calculated performance. Understanding her fear didn't erase the harm caused, but it did make her, undeniably, human. Regina turned toward me directly then, apologizing specifically for the fabricated complaints, the forged documents, and, most painfully, for the released hens and slashed tires, admitting she'd known about neither incident beforehand but recognized her broader campaign had created conditions enabling such cruelty regardless. I accepted her apology carefully, honestly, telling her that accountability mattered more than any single moment of contrition, that real change would require far more than words spoken under mounting pressure inside a crowded community meeting facing inevitable, undeniable consequences. The board reconvened briefly, then announced Regina's immediate suspension from HOA leadership pending formal investigation, Tom stepping into interim presidency, and a community-wide vote scheduled within 30 days to determine permanent leadership moving forward under genuinely transparent, accountable governance structures going forward. Regina left the meeting quietly that night, without her usual composed exit, without Brooke's careful staging, simply walking out alongside Ray, both looking smaller somehow than the polished, powerful figures who'd once dominated every Cedar Hollow gathering with effortless, practiced authority and control. Driving home, Lily asked quietly if Mrs. Vance was in trouble now. I explained gently that sometimes people make choices out of fear that hurt others badly, and that facing consequences honestly, however painful, mattered for everyone involved, including learning genuine lessons moving forward together. The following days brought official confirmation. The district attorney's office formally charged Vance Winery with willful environmental violations,
and the HOA board formally voided the forged bylaw amendment, restoring original protective language for agricultural exemptions predating the community's establishment decades earlier.
Dave Reyes called personally to update me on the criminal case's progress, mentioning quietly that my grandfather would likely have been proud watching this resolution unfold. A small, personal comment that meant more to me than any official legal victory possibly could have alone. Local news coverage expanded significantly. The story now framed accurately as governance corruption and environmental negligence rather than simple neighborhood squabbling, drawing attention from regional outlets interested in broader questions about HOA power, accountability, and vulnerable homeowners facing well-resourced, determined opposition. Neighbors who'd stayed silent throughout the ordeal began reaching out individually, apologizing quietly for their earlier fear-driven compliance, several admitting they'd genuinely believed my chickens caused problems until finally understanding the manufactured nature of complaints designed specifically to serve Regina's business interests. I found myself, somewhat unexpectedly, extending grace to many of these neighbors, understanding that fear operates powerfully within tight-knit communities, and that courage often requires collective momentum rather than isolated individual bravery against entrenched, intimidating authority structures like Regina's. Marisol began preparing documentation for potential civil damages related to fabricated complaints, property damage, and emotional distress, though she cautioned that pursuing every possible legal avenue might prolong exhausting proceedings rather than allowing genuine healing and closure for my family moving forward. I considered her advice carefully, discussing options extensively with Mike, ultimately deciding that reclaiming peace, protecting Lily's childhood from prolonged conflict, and restoring our simple, quiet farm life mattered more than pursuing every possible dollar of compensation legally available to us. With that decision made, I felt something shift within myself too, exhaustion slowly giving way to genuine relief, the accumulated weight of months spent fighting finally beginning to lift as our community's formal vote approached and Regina's chapter in Cedar Hollow's story neared its actual conclusion. The community vote arrived on a warm Saturday morning. Nearly every household in Cedar Hollow Estates turning out to the clubhouse, a turnout organizers said dwarfed any previous HOA election in the neighborhood's entire history, everyone sensing the genuine significance of this particular decision. Tom stood as interim president, opening proceedings formally, explaining the vote would determine both permanent leadership and several proposed bylaw reforms, including transparent recording requirements, independent complaint verification, and stronger protections against exactly the kind of manipulation the community had recently endured. Regina attended, quietly seated near the back, no longer campaigning, no longer performing, simply present as one resident among many, watching the community she'd once controlled absolutely now determine its own future through genuinely democratic, transparent process for perhaps the first time in years. Priscilla, Tom, and several other neighbors had organized a slate of reform-minded candidates, ordinary residents committed to accountability and fairness rather than image management or personal ambition, representing exactly the kind of leadership change Cedar Hollow desperately needed after everything that had unfolded. I hadn't planned to speak publicly that day, content simply attending as a supportive neighbor, until several people encouraged me directly, insisting my voice mattered given everything my family had endured throughout this exhausting, transformative ordeal spanning nearly 6 difficult months altogether. Standing before the packed room, I kept my remarks simple, thanking neighbors for finally finding courage together, emphasizing that Cedar Hollow's strength lay not in polished vineyards or elegant tasting rooms, but in genuine neighborly trust, fairness, and willingness to protect one another honestly. The room applauded warmly, several people wiping away tears, including, somewhat surprisingly, Regina herself, sitting quietly near the back, expression unreadable, but undeniably moved by the community's collective resilience despite everything she'd personally done to fracture it throughout her lengthy, complicated presidency. Voting proceeded smoothly throughout the afternoon. Ballots collected transparently by volunteer scrutineers rather than HOA staff alone. A deliberate reform ensuring genuine trust in results after months of documented manipulation. Forged signatures and manufactured complaints undermining previous governance processes entirely. As results were tallied that evening, tension filled the room again, though noticeably different from earlier confrontations. Hopeful anticipation replacing fearful uncertainty. Neighbors chatting warmly, sharing food, genuinely enjoying each other's company despite the significant decision hanging over the entire gathering. Tom finally announced results. The reform slate won overwhelmingly. Nearly 80% support, alongside near-unanimous approval for the proposed transparency bylaws, effectively ending Regina's political influence within Cedar Hollow Estates permanently, replaced by genuinely accountable, community-driven leadership moving forward. Cheers erupted throughout the clubhouse. Genuine relief and celebration replacing months of quiet fear and careful caution. Neighbors embracing each other warmly. Several approaching Priscilla, Tom, and Hector directly, thanking them personally for finding courage when courage genuinely mattered most. Regina slipped quietly out during the celebration. Ray following close behind, neither drawing attention nor seeking any final dramatic moment. Simply leaving as the community they'd once dominated moved forward. Deliberately, hopefully, without them steering its future any longer. I watched them go, feeling something complicated, not quite triumph, not quite pity, something closer to simple acknowledgement that consequences, however painful, ultimately followed genuine wrongdoing, and that Cedar Hollow, finally, would rebuild itself around fairness rather than fear moving forward. The following week brought additional news. Vance Winery, facing mounting legal fees, environmental fines, and collapsed business prospects following the resort deal's withdrawal, quietly listed the property for sale, effectively ending Regina and Ray's presence in Cedar Hollow Estates entirely within just months. Hearing this news, I felt no particular satisfaction watching their departure, only quiet relief that the immediate threat to my family, my land, and my flock had genuinely, finally passed, allowing us to focus entirely on rebuilding our simple, peaceful life together once more. Dave Reyes called again, confirming the criminal case against Vance Winery had reached a formal plea agreement. Substantial fines, mandatory environmental remediation, and a multi-year probationary period requiring regular compliance inspections. A resolution he called fair given the documented severity of repeated violations. Marisol finalized our own civil matter separately, securing modest compensation covering veterinary care for affected hens, security camera installation costs, and legal fees, resources allowing us to properly repair the coop, strengthen fencing, and finally move forward without lingering financial burden. Priscilla was elected board secretary under the new reform leadership, finally serving without fear of quiet coercion or hidden leverage, telling me privately how genuinely liberating it felt participating in HOA governance built around honesty rather than favors, fear, and carefully managed obligations. Tom took on the permanent board presidency himself, reluctantly at first, though neighbors insisted his quiet integrity throughout the entire ordeal made him exactly the steady, Trustworthy leader Cedar Hollow genuinely needed after years of Regina's polished but ultimately hollow governance. Hector left Vance Winery shortly before its sale, finding work at a smaller, family-owned vineyard nearby, one whose owners, he told me happily, actually valued honest labor over image management, treating employees like genuine partners rather than disposable, easily replaceable resources. Diane, the neighbor originally misled into filing the fabricated noise complaint, reached out with a heartfelt apology months later, admitting embarrassment over her role, however unwitting, in the entire situation. I accepted warmly, understanding fully how easily good people get manipulated by determined, calculating individuals. My hens, meanwhile, thrived once remediation efforts cleared lingering pesticide traces near our shared property line, egg production returning fully to normal within weeks. Duke the rooster crowing proudly each morning. Entirely unaware of the elaborate legal battle his crowing had unexpectedly triggered. Lily, watching everything unfold with a child's clear-eyed honesty, told me simply one evening that she was proud of me for not giving up even when the mean lady tried to win. Her simple, genuine pride meant more than any legal victory possibly could alone. New families moved into Cedar Hollow over following months, drawn partly by the community's now well-documented commitment to genuine fairness and transparency. Several specifically mentioning our story as reassurance that ordinary residents could successfully challenge entrenched, unfair authority when courage found collective momentum. I began quietly mentoring other homeowners facing similar HOA disputes elsewhere, sharing documentation strategies, legal resources, and simple encouragement that persistence, patience, and community solidarity genuinely mattered when confronting manipulation, however powerful or entrenched the opposition initially appeared. Marisol and I remained close afterward, occasionally collaborating on advocacy efforts supporting homeowners navigating similarly unfair governance situations. Her legal expertise combined with my genuine, hard-won experience creating resources neither of us could have developed effectively working entirely alone. The county eventually implemented stronger oversight measures for agricultural exemption reviews following our case, citing it specifically as an example motivating clearer, more protective regulatory language preventing future HOAs from quietly undermining legitimate, long-standing agricultural rights through manipulated procedural technicalities. Reflecting honestly on everything, I realized this entire ordeal, however exhausting and frightening throughout, ultimately strengthened Cedar Hollow's genuine sense of community far beyond anything Regina's polished vineyards or elegant tasting rooms had ever managed to create during her lengthy, image-focused presidency. 1 year later, standing at my fence line watching new vines being planted by the winery's new owners, a young couple genuinely excited about sustainable, responsible farming practices, I felt something close to peaceful closure settle finally over land my grandfather had cleared decades earlier. The new owners, learning our story, asked thoughtfully about proper buffer zones and safe agricultural practices before planting anything near our shared property line. A small but meaningful gesture confirming genuine lessons had been learned from everything our community had endured together. Regina's formal sentencing hearing for the environmental violations concluded quietly months later, the judge acknowledging her guilty plea, mounting fines, and the winery's forced sale as substantial consequences, while noting her eventual public accountability during the community meeting as a mitigating factor. She received probation rather than jail time, alongside a permanent prohibition against holding any homeowners association leadership position within the state. A specific condition Marisol had advocated for directly, ensuring Regina couldn't simply relocate and repeat similar patterns within another unsuspecting community. Right? Cooperating fully throughout the investigation. Avoided personal criminal liability entirely, though the couple's marriage reportedly struggled significantly under the accumulated financial and emotional strain, eventually separating quietly within the year, according to mutual acquaintances who'd known them both for years. The forged bylaw amendment's exposure prompted several other HOAs across the county to voluntarily audit their own governance records, at least 2 discovering similar procedural irregularities, suggesting Regina's methods, however extreme, weren't entirely unique within poorly regulated, insufficiently transparent homeowners association structures generally. Local journalists eventually published a longer feature piece examining the broader pattern, interviewing homeowners association experts about accountability gaps enabling controlling personalities like Regina's to accumulate outsized, largely unchecked power within communities lacking robust oversight, transparency requirements, or genuine democratic participation. I was interviewed briefly for that feature, careful to emphasize collective courage over individual heroism, insisting Priscilla, Tom, Hector, and even Ray's eventual honesty mattered every bit as much as my own persistence in exposing everything that had unfolded throughout our lengthy ordeal. The article's publication brought messages from strangers across the country, homeowners facing similarly unfair HOA situations, grateful simply knowing others had successfully challenged entrenched authority and won. However exhausting and frightening that particular journey had genuinely proven throughout our own extended experience. Regina, for her part, reportedly relocated eventually to another state entirely, starting over quietly according to distant mutual acquaintances, no longer involved in wine production or community governance, apparently choosing genuine anonymity over rebuilding any semblance of her previously prominent, carefully managed public identity. I never spoke with her directly again after that final community meeting, though I occasionally wondered whether she genuinely internalized any lasting lessons from everything that unfolded, or whether fear and desperation might eventually resurface differently within whatever new circumstances she'd chosen to build next. Marisol told me privately that regardless of Regina's personal growth or lack thereof, the systemic changes our case prompted, stronger oversight, transparency reforms, whistleblower protections, mattered considerably more than any single individual's redemption arc within this particular, deeply personal community story. Hector received a small community recognition award during Cedar Hollow's annual Harvest Festival, now organized transparently by the new HOA leadership rather than exclusively showcasing Vance Winery's interests, honoring his courage in speaking honestly despite genuine personal and professional risk involved throughout. Priscilla similarly received recognition, several neighbors specifically thanking her for the recorded evidence that ultimately proved decisive during the community meeting, acknowledging how frightening yet genuinely important her decision had been throughout months of quiet, careful, courageous documentation under significant personal pressure. Tom's steady, principled leadership throughout the transition earned widespread community trust. Several neighbors mentioning they finally felt genuinely comfortable raising concerns openly. Confident complaints would receive fair, transparent consideration rather than selective enforcement based on personal favor or political convenience. The county's Agricultural Extension Office, impressed by our documented case, invited me to speak briefly at a regional workshop about agricultural exemptions within expanding suburban developments, sharing practical advice for long-time farming families navigating increasingly encroaching residential community governance structures nationwide. Standing before that workshop audience, sharing our story honestly, twists and setbacks included, I felt genuine pride watching other attendees take notes, recognizing shared experiences, understanding perhaps for the first time that their own struggles weren't isolated. Hopeless situations but winnable, worthwhile fights. My grandfather's original 1962 deed, once nearly lost within careless HOA administrative shuffling, now hangs framed prominently in our farmhouse kitchen. A permanent reminder of both his original vision for this land and our family's hard-won victory protecting that vision decades later. Duke the Rooster, blissfully unaware of his unlikely role sparking such extensive community transformation, continues crowing proudly each morning, occasionally photographed by curious visitors learning our story. His confident presence now celebrated rather than quietly resented by neighbors throughout Cedar Hollow estates. Lily, now slightly older and considerably wiser about fairness, justice, and quiet courage, occasionally tells classmates proudly about when Mom and the chickens saved our farm, a slightly simplified version of events that nonetheless captures something genuinely true about our extended ordeal. Looking back across everything, I recognize clearly now that this fight was never truly about roosters, noise complaints, or property lines at all. It was about whether ordinary families could successfully protect their homes against determined, well-resourced authority willing to manipulate rules for personal gain. We could, ultimately, and we did, not through dramatic confrontation alone, but through patient documentation, genuine community solidarity, and simply refusing to accept unfairness quietly. However exhausting and frightening that persistent refusal genuinely proved throughout our long, transformative journey together. Cedar Hollow Estates today looks remarkably similar on the surface. Vineyards still stretching across rolling hills. Tasting rooms still welcoming curious tourists most weekends. Yet something fundamental shifted permanently beneath that familiar landscape. Genuine accountability finally replacing years of quiet, unchecked authority. My chickens remain exactly where my grandfather originally placed them decades ago. Protected now not just by an old legal exemption, but by an entire community that finally understood, through difficult, expensive experience, exactly why protecting longtime residents' legitimate rights matters more than polished appearances. Mike and I occasionally host informal gatherings now. Neighbors bringing wine from the community's newer, more responsibly managed vineyards, sharing eggs and stories together, genuinely enjoying the kind of neighborly warmth Regina's presidency had slowly, quietly eroded throughout her image-obsessed, controlling tenure. Marisol still checks in periodically, proud watching our small farm not just survive but genuinely thrive, occasionally reminding me that our case became something of a quiet legend among local property attorneys handling similarly stubborn, unfair homeowners association disputes throughout the surrounding county. Sometimes, standing at dawn listening to Duke's confident crow echoing across land my grandfather cleared over 60 years earlier, I feel simple, uncomplicated gratitude, not for winning exactly, but for refusing to disappear quietly when someone powerful decided our family's home was simply inconvenient. Cedar Hollow's newest residents rarely hear the full story anymore, just fragments passed casually between longtime neighbors. Something about chickens, Something about wine. Something about a rooster whose crowing accidentally exposed an entire scheme built on fear, forgery, and quiet desperation. I don't mind the fading details honestly. What matters most survived intact regardless. My family's land, my grandfather's legacy, and a community finally brave enough to choose fairness over fear whenever the next Regina inevitably arrives, testing exactly how far unchecked power might genuinely reach. Duke crows every morning still, right on schedule, utterly unbothered by everything his voice once triggered. And honestly, watching the sun rise peacefully over land we fought so hard to keep, I wouldn't trade a single difficult, exhausting moment of this entire journey.